Hello again, everyone. It's Mr. Most Days Off, and I am back again here, right here on thefanspodcast.com to talk to you today about The Simpsons. We've got a couple of good episodes to talk about today. One's definitely interesting. I'm excited to get to. But before we get ahead of ourselves, I'm not here to talk to you to The Simpsons alone today. I have once again brought with me your co-host with the most, Richie the Wiz Kid. How are you today, Richie?
I'm doing fine and dandy like sour candy, Miles. How are you doing today? The man, the myth, the Millhouse. It is Mr. Most Days Off over there, Miles.
Yeah, man, super excited. This is our second episode talking about The Simpsons, and if you're following along, we're going to be doing 2 episodes at a time, so that means we're going to be doing episode 3 and episode 4 today. That's going to be Homer's Odyssey, and There Is No Disgrace Like Home. Let's go ahead and jump right into Homer's Odyssey, which debuted on January 21st, 1990. You know what? Before we get into that, let me just bring up that date. Let's put that in a little bit of context. I just so happened to read today that season 28 of The Simpsons premieres this year on September 25th. That is such... just looking at those dates, even knowing the show has been on as long as it has been, that still is just mind-blowing to think about.
Well, you actually get to kind of see that in this episode a little bit, too. And what I mean by that is, like, just the way times have changed, and we're now in this very PC age. There's a scene that we'll get to about this where Homer blatantly is trying to commit suicide, and it's like no big deal, and people are making fun of him, and it's like, I don't think you could do this scene like this in this day and age, basically.
I know exactly what you're talking about. We're gonna get to that because it's that also crossed my mind, that just like, wow, how times have changed.
Yeah.
And you know, at this point, if that scene were to air the way that it aired back then, there would be at least a dozen different fucking social justice warrior groups just talking about how that's offensive to people that have committed suicide or whatever. But yeah, so let's go ahead and jump in here. We're doing Homer's Odyssey again. That debuted on January 21st, 1990. Barely in the 90s, but still part of the 90s. We start with your traditional Simpsons opening. We've got Bart scrawling on the chalkboard. I believe this one was, "I will not skateboard through the halls," which of course he immediately does right after the bell rings. And then the couch gag, they're starting out a little bit lame, to be honest. Like well, it's early, so they've not really done anything yet, so they don't have to get as zany with it to stay fresh. But this one, just quite simply, all 5 members of the Simpsons jump on the couch, and it just kind of falls to pieces.
I like the way that this episode actually started off, though. Like, I thought that was one of the funnier moments, was right off the bat with Mrs. Krabappel. The kids are going on a field trip. This is the episode where they go to the nuclear power plant on a field trip. But I love the way it starts off, where Mrs. Krabappel states that she doesn't want a repeat of the state prison field trip.
The infamous state prison field trip.
And you kind of figure out that Bart opened up some of the cages there, some of the prison gates.
Yeah, that also cracked me up a lot. And then we jumped right into a introduction to a very notable character.
Yes, we did.
Otto makes his first appearance, which actually I did, after we watched this episode, I did read on IMDb, and there's quite a few introductions we'll get to, but I'm just going to go ahead and list them out real quick. This episode introduces in person an actual image of Waylon Smithers, which there's something interesting about him we'll talk about here.
I bet I have the same note you do.
We also meet the twins, Terry and Sherry. Otto, we just spoke of. Chief Wiggum, and probably the most important introduction that this episode brings is Duff Beer, the first appearance of Homer's favorite brew.
They also introduced Wendell in this one as well, which
you are correct.
You never really see him that much throughout the years with any important roles. This honestly might be his biggest scene in the series.
Yeah, that's kind of, I did see his name on the list, and I did kind of just omit him due to the fact that he doesn't do a whole lot throughout the series. But you're right, you're totally right in that he is there. That's totally the case. But so the kids are going on a tour of the power plant where Homer happens to work, and jumping right into it. We meet African-American Waylon Smithers, which is interesting to me.
It's the one and only episode where he will be black, and in the very next episode, he will be white all of a sudden, with no explanation.
Also, jumping around a little here, but just kind of an interesting fact, too. In the next episode, there's No Disgrace Like Home that we're going to talk about. Officer Lou was drawn in traditional Simpsons
Yeah.
yellow instead of African American as he's portrayed the rest of the series. So I don't know if maybe they were just, still feeling things out for the TV episode or what they wanted to do with this, but I did think possibly as far as whaling goes, maybe if they knew what they were planning on doing it with how Mr. Burns treats him in certain episodes, it may have been culturally insensitive to keep him as a African American, which technically is racist on its own merit, but that's a whole deeper conversation to get into.
And that's
later.
before you even bring up the fact that he's clearly and obviously gay.
Yeah, totally. It's very, very much so. Early on, I think it's arguably hinted at, but throughout the course of the season, it's not hinted. They've made it abundantly clear.
Right. Another cool first. You're talking about firsts in this one with all the first appearances. One of the other cool first appearances in this is the first phone call to the bar from Bart ragging on Moe. You never go wrong with those. Those are some of my favorite gags through the whole series.
Absolutely. I believe this one was Mr. I.P. Freely, if I remember correctly. Yeah, that was. You're absolutely right. The Bart prank calls really show who the character of Bart is really well early on. I mean, that was before this became a 28 season beast of a show. These were very primitive characters with really simple backstories. I mean, Bart is just Brat misspelled. I mean, that's a known that they've said that on several occasions that's how his name came to be. Is he was a bratty kid, and that name just kind of fit for him.
And they actually have a joke with that name, which is one of my favorite quotes, I think, in the next episode.
Right on. We'll save that for our quotes on the next one. But moving on to this episode, pretty early on, Bart is with the class touring through, and he sees Homer and calls out, and of course Homer, being the buffoon that he is, ends up causing a complete meltdown of an accident in the nuclear power plant, and he ends up being fired in front of Bart and all of his friends. And to make it worse, he's fired by Terry and Cherry's father, who Terry and Cherry have already been established in an earlier scene on the bus to be the type of troublemakers that never fucking get caught for anything. Like, they're always instigating, but they're never actually getting caught. Like the type of person that would get me in trouble when I was a kid. So I totally felt for Bart in this scene.
You're so emotionally attached.
Totally. But nonetheless, Bart is in fact humiliated because his father gets fired right in front of him. And this sort of turns into not exactly a montage, but a series where Homer is trying to find a job. He says he's young and he's happy to do anything, so he's going around, and this, I guess, was a montage of just getting doors slammed in his face over and over and over again.
Including his own.
Including his own by his sons. Something notable here that I thought, well, to be perfectly honest, I barely remember this episode at all, but there is a scene in particular where they do Marge basically talks about how she could go back to her old job if she needed to, and that her boss told her that she'd always have a place to be. And Homer was, of course, like, are you sure you'd still be able to do that kind of work? And long story short, we get like a 3-second scene of Marge being a car hop on roller skates. I would have sworn I've never seen that image before as Marge of the car hop. I don't know how, but that whole joke just completely has slipped my mind. Didn't remember it at all.
Well, I think a little bit of that is because it's the first season, and honestly, it's one of the harder ones to go back and watch once the show establishes itself a few episodes in. And another reason after that, that might be something that you don't remember is, like, honestly, man, this is one of my lesser favorite episodes of this season. The whole Homer not having a job and trying to fight for safety and all this other stuff, it feels like they were still trying to feel out the character in some ways on this episode. And I'm not a big fan of the direction they took. There's still a lot of funny moments because it's The Simpsons, but overall, it's not really a memorable episode.
It seemed, you mentioned it, it feels a little bit to me like just an odd placement of Homer losing his job so early in the season, or in the series, excuse me, because he really hadn't even been established at his place of employment. I mean, there was a couple of scenes where it was mentioned that, that's where he worked, I believe, but there was really no establishment of his job, what he did. The only thing that you really get a glimpse of it in is it still to this day, as far as I know, shows him in his original position at work when he's in the opening credits of the show and he's handling the plutonium rod or whatever it is. But yeah, this his firing comes really quickly, and I guess in some ways it establishes his position as the safety supervisor.
Because he wasn't that before, so this episode put him into his current position for the last 28 years.
You just think that, yeah, exactly. It just, like, in my mind, it almost seems like this show would have, or this story arc would have made more sense a little bit later into the season after we've had him established. Basically you kind of care about them more as a family, and then it would probably be a little bit more emotionally, riveting for you whenever they have the breadwinner lose their job.
Yep, and then after this all happens and they're waiting in that one office, we get another first mention in this episode, the first mention of El Barto, which I thought I really like that little throw in there.
I like that too. I think this happened before we got to that scene, but I could be wrong. But there's a moment where Homer is laying on the couch and the TV is playing Loaf Time, cable network for the unemployed, and they were about to show more tips on how to win the lottery up next. That just absolutely slayed me. I don't know if that can count as my quote of the show or not, since it was said by the TV, but holy
TV's
shit, that was great.
Man.
And then immediately after that, we get it's Duff Time, which made that was the commercial, and then Homer, of course, gets up and says one of the more famous lines, "Beer, now there's a temporary solution," which I also thought was great. But I got to wondering, I think Duff Time might predate Miller Time. I don't know when Miller Time's ads first started airing, but I thought that wasn't until the late 90s, unless that was an older catchphrase that they recycled in the 90s.
Well, man, The Simpsons always inspires mimicry, and that's something that I'm going to talk about a lot in the next episode here. So it wouldn't surprise me either way. It wouldn't surprise me if Miller Time came out after, or if Duff was just making fun of them. But honestly, it doesn't really matter because it's The Simpsons, so The Simpsons are going to get credit for it. But yeah, I really I actually wrote down the beer, now there's a temporary solution as well. And then the scene that's right after that was actually probably my favorite quote of the episode. And I didn't even see it written down anywhere else, so I had to go back 5 times to write down all the words. But, Homer wants beer really bad, but he doesn't have a job, and they're barely scraping by, so he goes in and breaks Bart's piggy bank to get some beer money. And he says, not even enough to buy one beer. Then he goes, "Wait a minute, let me count." And he gets almost a little bit of hope, and then he just goes, "Not even close." And I was like, oh, it's so pathetically sad. He's stealing from his kid to get beer money out of his piggy bank.
You had already talked about it a little bit, but I believe that's the moment when he realizes how pathetic he's fallen, where he's stolen from his kid and didn't even come up with enough for a beer, that he in fact does what you talked about earlier and ties a boulder to himself and then starts walking towards the bridge.
Which won't be the last time Homer has a rock tied to him.
No, it won't be. That's true. Initiation rituals, totally. I can't wait till we get there. That's a good one. But yes, he's walking through town, and there's an older couple that even kind of joke about the fact that looks like Homer's off to kill himself, and it's just holy shit. One of my favorite moments, though, is along the way, they start showing that there's very clear traffic issues, which will become a bigger part of the episode here in a bit. But as they're getting there, he gets to the bridge, sees that there's already a giant boulder there, and is just like, huh, you live and you learn. Just fucking guilt. Good stuff with that.
How did the rock get back up there?
Right? I guess the guy jumped and he didn't have a very good knot tied, is my guess.
Yeah, it's the dark humor that you couldn't get away. Even South Park would have to tread carefully in the way that they approach that kind of suicide joking nowadays. Which again, like we touched on earlier, it's really odd when you think about it, because when you see the scene, when I was a kid, it didn't really mean that much to me. I was like, oh, that's sad, he's gonna kill himself. But nowadays, again, with our everyone being so PC, it does strike you as odd and catch you a little off guard for a split second.
It pisses me off that we live in such a PC fucking friendly world that we do notice things like that. I totally agree. Like when I was younger, that wouldn't have even fazed me. And obviously, you could make the argument that like as we get older, we just have more heart about things like this. But ultimately, it's a fucking joke, and people shouldn't be so goddamn sensitive about shit. But that's just me.
Well, something to add on the suicide scene. I actually missed it because I was writing other notes down. But the pad that Homer writes his suicide note on, it's called "Dumb Things I Gotta Do Today," and that's courtesy of The Simpsons: A Complete Guide to Our Favorite Family. So thank you very much for that.
It seems like a really appropriate to do or like stationary for to do list because I mean essentially that's what most of the stuff that we all do on a daily basis is.
Yeah. But anyways, on this one, obviously Homer doesn't kill himself. His family almost gets hit by a car, and Homer realizes that intersection needs a stop sign. So he starts another montage in this episode of him putting up stop signs and dip signs and all kinds of traffic signs all over
Any
the town.
sort of sign that could possibly. There was even a sign warning of an upcoming sign.
Yeah, and this is just reflective of the name of the episode, which is Homer's Odyssey, and he doesn't have anything that makes him feel worthwhile. So he's filling his void with all these safety signs, and this is what I touched on earlier in the podcast here, where I feel like they just Homer all around hasn't been well defined yet, which kind of leads to episodes like this when you're flushing out the character a little bit, and it didn't. It's one of the reasons I don't like this episode because I don't really get why he stays on this crusade with all this signs, besides the fact that he has nothing better to do, and it just didn't feel complete to me as a character.
Yeah, I could see your point on that, and I think that in a lot of ways, a bunch of that is to do with the fact that this is not really establishing Homer as much as a character as it is establishing his role in the community with the whole being the safety inspector of the power plant thing that's going to be coming up here. Long story short, Homer gets to the point where he feels like he's doing all of these things, like Richie said, but nothing's really happening. So he decides that he's going to take on the power plant, which is clearly the most dangerous thing in the town. And that's where we actually get to my absolute favorite quote in this episode. I forgot about it earlier. The other ones were good too, but this one, he's giving his speech to the mobs of people outside the power plant, all there to protest. And he starts by saying, "Unlike most of you, I am not a nut." And that just
always a great way to
me.
start a public address.
Yeah. So he's riling everyone up, and sure enough, Mr. Burns takes notice and has Smithers go and retrieve him to come up to his office, where he is offered a job essentially as safety instructor, or safety supervisor. But part of that job would include announcing to everyone that the plant is in fact safe. And this is the moment where I think, to your point earlier, that we get a little bit more in tune with who the Homer J. Simpson character becomes, just because of the fact that even though he doesn't really have a lot of morals, he does care about the people around him ultimately, and that's kind of where he draws the line on a lot of issues.
Well, and this is also where we get our first Burns Homer meeting in his office. And I put a note down when I wrote down it was the first time they're meeting in his office. I put, "Will he remember Homer's name?" So we'll see how that pans out in the future. But yeah, it's again a lot of firsts in this one. One of the things I really liked about this episode with Homer being in the power plant is the video they showed the kids about how nuclear energy, how safe it is, and why it's so effective. And it's just for for a cartoon that was airing in the early '90s. I mean, they were making fun of nuclear energy and nuclear power, and
nuclear waste. Yeah,
a way to pronounce it the Homer way there. Nuclear. It's pronounced nuclear. But yeah, nuclear power and everything that goes into it, and just how they were kind of mocking it by making it try to look safe. I thought was a pretty cool little touch for the third episode of a long running series.
For sure. And another fun fact on that is, according to the IMDb that we often reference here, that, while being insanely simplified, is actually accurate to how nuclear energy really does work.
That doesn't surprise me at all. These writers are usually on top of their game, especially in the earlier years.
Oh yeah, again, as you mentioned, I think last week, a lot of these guys are from Harvard or Yale and things
Yeah.
like that. These are some top notch fucking talents that do this show. There's a reason that it stood the test of time. I think that pretty much wraps up Homer's Odyssey. Is there anything that you'd like to add, or that your complete idiot's guide for Simpsons fans wants to chime in for
Well,
us?
another first. It actually mentions that there is a three-eyed fish swimming in the nuclear plant in a pond.
It doesn't really mention it. You just see him swim upstream as you're going through.
I did think it was quite funny that after it wraps up and Homer becomes the safety inspector, that as soon as he becomes a safety inspector, he immediately falls off the railing, which is just kind of a metaphor for how he will be as a safety inspector.
And luckily he lands on the crowd, which also kind of sums up Homer Simpson because he's constantly doing dumb things and getting out of them on pure dumb luck.
It's better to be lucky than good.
Absolutely. All right, anything else you want to add on for Homer's Odyssey?
Like I said, not it's probably one of my lesser favorite episodes of the first season.
Which is saying something because I think you've also more or less said that the first season is among your least favorite seasons to watch in general.
Yeah, there's a couple.
Which I would
There's
agree
a couple
with.
really good episodes, and one of them is the next one we're about to talk about. But I mean, it's just yeah. Again, they're just trying to find their footing, and I owned the first season on VHS many years ago, so I've seen all those episodes so many times, and I think that factors into it a little bit. So my judgment could be slightly skewed. There are some good episodes in the first season.
So moving on to, I agree, a very good episode, but watching it through this time made me notice some things that I've never noticed before. Maybe this is the first time I've ever watched an episode of Simpsons with a notepad in my hand taking notes on it. So maybe I just noticed because of that reason, or maybe it's just because I'm considerably older than I was the last time I watched this. I don't know, but we're going to talk about some interesting things on this episode. First of all, this episode premiered just 1 week after the third on January 28th, 1990. We move through the opening intro, which is the traditional style. It has "I will not burp in class" for the chalkboard gag, and Homer essentially just kind of pops out of the couch and lands on the floor when everybody gets in. Very similar to the first week, the second episode, the one where Bart goes flying, but not as comically far would be the only thing. And we do get a couple of additional introductions of notability in this episode as well. A big role at the end of this show is going to be Dr. Monroe,
May he rest
who
in peace.
I think we see. Oh yeah, I forgot he did die in one of the episodes, didn't he?
They randomly mention it like he's just not there anymore, and it's like, what popular characters died in Simpsons? And it ended up being Bleeding Gums Murphy and Dr. Marvin Monroe and Troy McClure. Troy McClure goes,
yeah.
if that's what you guessed, you were wrong. They were never popular.
Dude, that was on like a Simpsons like recap episode, like a
show.
special. I don't know.
I think it was like the 137th episode or something like that.
And a really really fun one. Like in terms of like a clip show, they do it right, man. Like that shit's like the only one that I can think of that reminds me of a similar episode is the episode of South Park where they do a flashback episode where none of the stuff they flash back to actually ever happened on the show, but they all talk about it as if we should just know what it is. But let's save all that for when we actually get there. Great episode, though. Super excited. Other than Dr. Monroe, we also get Officer Lou, who I already mentioned earlier, is actually drawn in Simpsons yellow instead of black, as he becomes throughout the rest of the series. And then, probably most notably, we see the first appearance of Itchy and Scratchy.
Wrote that one down with exclamation marks. Some of the best characters on the show when they aren't actual people in the town, but Itchy and Scratchy is awesome. Always awesome.
Yeah, man, I agree entirely with that. The Itchy and Scratchy make such a great, I guess characters is the right term for them, but just stuff that opens up for possibilities with that, like Itchy and Scratchy Land, for instance, and
yes.
things like that have derived, or I can't remember the damn name of the dog, but whenever they add
Poochie?
the dog, Poochie, fucking Poochie, like shit like that, it makes for great fucking episodes. So super excited to have Itchy and Scratchy on board.
Before we get into what happens in this episode, I want to present what I felt like the theme of this episode is, and that way you can think of that while you're listening to our review of it. This episode is clearly about Homer wanting his family to be quote unquote normal, like all the other families, and he's trying to stick to this idea through the entire episode. But then in the final moments of the episode, when everything works out okay and they get what they need, it's because the Simpsons embrace who they are and that they aren't normal, and that even Homer realizes that that's completely okay, and that is their version of being normal. And I actually thought that was like a great little theme for the episode that they don't come out and just say. You just have to watch what happens in the episode to get it.
Yeah, I like that, man. That's good. I dig all that. So while thinking about that, let's get into the opening of this, where we see that they are essentially, or actually, one of the very first lines in this actually cracked me up. We see Bart and Lisa fighting. No, you do. No, you do. No, you do. Whatever. And Homer basically comes up and asks, what are you guys fighting about? And they say, we're arguing over who loves you more. And that's when it's revealed that they're arguing that the other loves Homer more than they do. And that was pretty fucking funny. And then we also see a scene right after that where Homer, I think, burps, and Marge is like, you're being disgusting. And he's like, well, I want to get some of these unfortunate noises out of my system before we get to the party. Totally know how you feel there, dude. But but yeah, so they're on their way to Mr. Burns' employee picnic. And this is where I started to notice just a little bit some really strange characteristics from the family, in that, for one, Homer is seemingly being the responsible one here. He's the one that's trying to drive them getting to the picnic on time and everybody behaving and everyone looking nice. And this is very much traditionally a Marge role that Homer is playing.
Which goes back into the what I proposed as the theme of the episode, where he's wanting everyone to be normal and he's trying to get them to be that way, and it makes him the authoritative figure in this episode. Sure.
But we get to the picnic itself, and immediately Bart and Lisa start misbehaving and driving Homer crazy. And that was actually another just slightly thing I noticed. And I always check IMDb after I watch the episode, and they actually do talk about a lot of these things I noticed, but we'll save that for the end. I did notice that Lisa was acting very much more like Bart than she normally does, just in the sense that usually Lisa is quiet and well-behaved and kind of, a lot of times, the only voice of reason in the family. Well, Marge as well, but very much the more in tune with following the rules type of thing. And in this one, she's playing in a fountain while Bart is trying to chase the geese, I believe.
Yeah, and again, they find out better ways to do this years down the road. There's other episodes where they go to like high-end society clubs, and the thing that makes Lisa act up is like they have ponies there, or horses, and she gets like all giddy and overly excited about the horses, and it makes her drunk on the love for the horses. Whereas in this earlier first season episode, they haven't really established those parameters yet. So if they need to write the characters to be little hellions to drive in the point of making Homer angry that they're not normal, it's easier to get away with this early in the show.
You're absolutely right, yeah, and that pony point was spot on, because at the end of the day, Lisa is still, even 28 years later, is an 8-year-old little girl. And while she's an insanely intelligent and well-behaved 8-year-old girl, there are moments throughout the show where she lets her 8-year-old self out. And this is definitely one of those moments. But they didn't feel it necessary to really give a reason for this one, other than the fact that she's just 8 and bored at a party. Because that totally happens in real life. I don't know if you've ever been around an 8-year-old, but that's absolute. I mean, shit, I get bored at parties and want to go play in the fountain, so I totally understand where they're coming from.
Yeah, well, and that's that scene happens right after Mr. Burns meets the family, and that was one of my more favorite. It's not my favorite quote. There's 2 others in this episode that are way better than this, but I love it when, and this goes back to what you said during the last episode, where Burns looks at Bart and he says, "This must be Brat." And Bart goes, "Bart," and Homer says, "Don't correct the man, Brat." It's not always the words, but it's just the delivery of the words on the show, and the pacing and the timing. You can have a 1-word sentence that Homer or Bart utters, and the way they do it and the look they give half the time is like over half of the joke.
Totally, I agree that it's very much so like a real sitcom, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, just in the sense that not animated, because a lot of times it's not just that anyone could say the line and it'd be funny, but like if you go back and look at something like Friends, where it's not that necessarily what Chandler would say as much as it is how Chandler said it. Very much so true with a character like Homer J. Simpson, for sure, and Bart for that matter as well. But the way that Homer delivers the "don't correct the boy, Brat" was absolutely perfect.
Well, and getting back to what you just said, it's harder to show those kind of little nuances in a cartoon. I mean, yeah, you can draw whatever you want to, but getting back to what you said about Friends, you see Chandler make all these over-the-top gestures and do things with his eyes. And on a cartoon show, you have to draw all that. You have to show that Homer's kind of talking under his lips a little bit. And when he's talking to Bart, like as an aside, kind of. And I think that's something that, for a show that was doing it early on, pulled off remarkably well.
Definitely.
We talked a lot about one little tiny line.
Yeah, we really fucking did. So I wanted to get on to basically what happens next is where this really clicked in with their having like a role reversal type of situation happening. Because long story short, Marge turns the fuck up on Punch. Like, she gets drunk, like Homer style drunk.
Alcohol.
And yeah, there's I actually kind of dug the moment where they're singing and she's, you know, like dancing on the rails and whatnot. I really had hoped that turned into a joke where it turns out just very much like they do with Homer at times, where in her mind she was like the queen of the party, but in reality she was like sloshing all over people and like spilling her drink and like, you know, just making an ass of herself. I think it would have driven in the point a little bit more of what they were doing, but that could have also been overkill.
Yeah, again, I still think it goes back to the fact that Homer had to be the authoritative figure in this episode for the point they're trying to make. I actually have the lyrics to the song in my little companion guide here, but I don't want to read them because it's a pretty boring song.
Yeah, it's not the best of Simpsons. It's no monorail song for sure.
Oh my god, I could sing that off the top of my head right now, for sure.
So, well, you know what? Hey, tell you what, Richie just said it, so we're going to make the announcement now. When we get to the monorail episode, Richie is going to sing the monorail song for everyone.
What's it called?
Monorail, you know it.
Raise your voice.
Save it. All right.
But Main Street's still all cracked and broken. Sorry, Mom, the mob has spoken.
All right, so Mr. Burns announces everyone needs to go home. He mentions the hounds for the first time, that they will be released if they're not off the property. Homer sees all these other families, you know, being sweet to each other and shit, and realizes more and more that his basically family sucks compared to everyone else's, and he's not okay with this. He gets home, and this is where shit gets real weird with Homer, because he, for the first time I've ever seen, tries to get the family to stop eating in front of the television, which is very out of character.
But before you get to that, I wanted to mention on their way out of the mansion party, this quick little spot completely defines Waylon Smithers' character. When Burns sees Homer pay Bart to give him a kiss in front of Burns to make Homer look better and like a better family man, Burns makes a quip about Homer obviously trying to curry favor with himself, Mr. Burns, and Smithers immediately smiles and he says, "Fabulous observation, sir." And Burns smiles as soon as Smithers says that. And the way Smithers delivers it is Smithers was obviously doing exactly what Homer was trying to do, but it worked. And that just kind of establishes the kiss ass that Smithers is towards Mr. Burns for the entire series. And it's really brief and really quick, but like 27 seasons down the road, it's such a cool little moment like now to go back and see. And sorry, but to get back, another troubling thing is Homer fights with TV for the first time, which is a rarity.
Yeah, it is, and he gets the family to the table away from the TV, which is strange in itself.
I don't think it's strange though. I think it goes back to what I've been saying this whole time.
To your theory, for sure. I still think it's strange, even with your theory, but that, you know, we can nitpick that. But I do think there's a really good moment here. Homer decides that he wants to pray over dinner, and they keep not really taking it serious. At one point, Marge is like, "How long do we have to sit here and listen to you badmouth us to the man upstairs?" And Homer says, "Sometimes I think we're the worst family in town." To which Marge says, "Maybe we should move to a bigger community."
Yeah.
That was my favorite line in the show for sure. Really, really spot on for the Simpsons humor.
And for Marge, she doesn't always get the funniest of lines at times, so it's good to see her get a little jab in. But again, that could be because they haven't established the parameters and they're all playing kind of opposites in this episode. That definitely leads Homer to go to his favorite spot in Springfield, I think, which would be Moe's Tavern.
Yep.
And that's where you get to see cops drinking on the job.
Yeah, and that's where we see Officer Lou drawn in yellow. If you were curious about where that little moment happens, that's where it's at. But yeah, so Barney and Homer get in a little bit of a scuffle over Barney talking some shit about his family. And then after the scuffle, Homer's on the ground and he sees a TV ad pop up with Dr. Monroe advertising that for $250 he can fix your family, basically. Homer has an epiphany, realizes, he actually says, and this cracks me up, when will I learn? The answers to life's problems aren't at the bottom of a bottle. They're on TV.
And see, that's the first instance in this episode where Homer starts to go back to who he actually is. When he stopped fighting, he was fighting with TV literally a scene ago, and this is down the road towards resolution. This is where it's starting to happen, and it's when he starts basically reconciling with TV again.
However, there's one more major character swap moment that I want to talk about, and that is Homer is convinced that they need to go see Dr. Monroe. The kids and Marge, not so much, especially when he tells Marge how much it's going to cost. They're scouring through everything to figure out how to get enough money, and Homer essentially says they need to make the ultimate sacrifice, pawn the television, to which, in a very Homer idea, says, oh no, not the TV, couldn't we pawn my engagement ring instead?
Marge said that.
Yeah, Marge says that, and then Homer replies, we need $150, so we need to do something better, or something like that, implying that Marge's ring isn't worth that much. But it seems to me like Marge pawning her engagement ring is very out of character, and much more in tune with something that Homer would think of over pawning the TV, to which usually it doesn't seem as that important to Marge.
Yeah, but again, it's the fourth episode of the series, and I still stand by my theme. Something that I wanted to talk about when they're in Moe's Tavern, that it took a second and then it clicked with me. When Homer's talking about he's talking to Barney right before they have their little scuffle, Homer talks about his mom and says how when he was a kid, his mom told him that he was going to be a great disappointment. And I actually put a note right there because I thought, seasons and seasons down the road, you finally meet Homer's mother, and she gives nothing but unconditional love. And it's something where, like, obviously this is first couple episodes of the series, so they're going to change things, but like Homer's mom would never call him a disappointment ever.
Yeah, you're totally right, but I would imagine that Homer's mom probably wasn't even considered, even thought of as a character, a possible character
right.
at this
We haven't
point.
Even seen Grandpa yet, have we?
No, yeah, we haven't seen Abe Simpson yet, so that's gonna be another fun one that should be. I do believe he does appear in season 1.
That he should. Yeah, because Bart the General, he helps out a lot in that episode. I think that one's coming up.
Yeah, and that's
the next episode.
I think that's gonna be on next week's show. Yeah, it's not the next episode. I think it's 2 away. I think it's episode 6.
I have it as the very next episode.
Oh, I could be wrong. I'll double check here. I was gonna announce that at the end of the show, but anyway, so before we get to that, let's get to the end of this episode.
Whoa! There's still more going on here, man. We're on a network that is involved with wrestling, and you don't even want to talk about the fact that Lisa takes a jab at pro wrestling.
There is a jab at pro wrestling. You are absolutely correct, though. I would say that it was Homer that took more of the jab than Lisa did.
I think it was kind of a joint effort, but I understand where you're coming from.
So the idea here is that while Homer's trying to convince the family that the therapy is a good idea, Lisa essentially says something along the lines of, like, Dad, you're going to take us to a therapist that advertises on pro wrestling? And then Homer says, it's boxing, not pro wrestling, hon. They're very different. Something of that nature, implying that, like...
He says it's a world of difference.
Well, yeah, there you go. It's a world of difference. Basically implying that wrestling isn't a real sport. As wrestling fans, we've all heard this before, nothing new. But The Simpsons did it way back in 1990, and it was actually pretty fucking funny. So,
yep.
There you go.
And that leads to what you said earlier, what's the ultimate moment of sacrifice for Homer, which you touched on, but not in the way that I've been with my theme.
Go ahead, take it,
ultimate,
man. Run with
the
it.
ultimate symbol of Homer being so sold on wanting his family to be normal is when he does decide to pawn their TV, and he's completely fought against himself now at this point, and he has nothing left to do. This is kind of like the last straw, more so or less.
You nailed it. That's what they decided that they had to do if they were going to be able to cover the $250 fee to do therapy. So they're off with their cash to see Dr. Monroe. They go through a series of exercises where at first it seems everybody flames Homer, and then everyone's seen the scene that's coming up. They start with foam-covered bats in which they get to hit each other with to kind of get their aggression out in a safe manner. Bart at one point points out, hey man, these are covered in foam. It would work better if you take it off. Dr. Monroe tries to stop him, but he's like, no, see? And he hits him in the knee. Hilarious. Probably one of the most famous scenes of all of season 1, honestly, I would argue.
It's still hilarious.
And still absolutely hilarious. Holds
and
up
Clockwork
for sure.
Orange.
The Simpsons Dr. Monroe straps the Simpsons into electric chairs, and they're all connected to each other with a series of buttons where they can shock each other. They're supposed to talk to each other and buzz each other anytime that they hurt each other emotionally so that they can connect when their actions cause emotional pain, blah, blah, blah. Of course, that's not what happens. They just commence shocking the absolute shit out of each other.
It's when they start acting like themselves. This is the moment where Homer finally breaks
you're right.
and says, I'm going to be me in his head, and they start shocking the crap out of each other.
They start shocking each other relentlessly. Mr. Burns couldn't be happier because the power grid is going off the charts. He makes a joke.
Perhaps the energy conservation fad is as dead as the dodo, is what he says.
There you go. Dr. Monroe is completely worried about his equipment. The lights are flashing. His patients are fleeing in fear. Long story short, he tells them that they have to go. He can't help them. Homer reminds them that according to the commercial, if they can't give your family bliss, it's double your money back. And so, once again, in a bit of dumb luck instead of actually being good, proving, as always, it's better to be lucky than good, the Simpsons leave with $500. They suggest, I think Marge suggests they go and get their TV back, to which Homer replies, hell no, we're going to go get a 21-inch, which is comically small by today's standards, but hilarious that that's their upgrade. They're going to go get a 21-inch and a little rolling cart so they can push the TV in front of the dinner table at holidays.
And it's at this moment where you've seen that Homer has embraced who and what his family is. And it made everything okay at the end. They solve things their own way, and it doesn't matter that they're not one of those normal families that went running and screaming out of Dr. Marvin Monroe's office, because that's who the Simpsons are.
You're absolutely right. This is definitely possibly the moment we'll see going into these next few episodes, but this very well could be the actual moment the Simpsons are born, and by that we mean who they really become as personalities.
My favorite quote was right before they walked through the doors to start all the therapy, when Marge told Homer, "You're driving a stake through the hearts of the ones who love you," and Homer says, "No pain, no gain." That was my favorite quote because it's so like he didn't give a flying fuck. He just
I don't give a fuck. That's my new thing. Well, sir, I think that pretty much covers everything for There's No Disgrace Like Home. Is there anything that you or the Complete Idiot's Guide to The Simpsons would like to add to this episode?
One last thing I wanted to touch on. I know I've been driving home themes all day. I wrote this note down because
you're proud of it. Fuck it, go with it. I like it.
I feel like I'm on a good tread right now.
Fuck yeah, man.
When the Simpsons are all drawing what makes them angry, and they all draw Homer, Dr. Marvin Monroe says, "Homer, your family views you as an ogre." And as soon as he said that, I wrote down a quick note. I don't know, most of you out there in podcast land have seen the movie Shrek, and I
would hope so. It's a great movie.
My whole theme about this episode is about being yourself and that your version of normal is okay. And I was like, holy crap, that was the theme of Shrek. And like I knew that the first time I saw Shrek, but I was like, holy crap, Shrek totally stole the idea for their movie off this episode. Like, Homer was literally called an ogre, and Homer was fighting what being normal for him meant, and that's the whole theme behind Shrek, is to be who you are and be proud of it. And it made me write down the note, Simpsons did it. So, Shrek, I'm onto you guys out there.
That makes me wonder if, I know a lot of the SNL guys worked with The Simpsons back then. I wonder if Michael Myers was ever a writer for The Simpsons.
Ooh, that would make sense.
You know, it's actually interesting, dude, is, so this is a just side tangent for you guys to look up if you ever want to, but they actually started making the movie Shrek with Chris Farley as Shrek, obviously before he tragically passed away, and it was a much different character. There is no I don't think they have any digital footage to my knowledge, but I do believe they actually did have a table read of audio available out there somewhere in the depths of the interweb. But it's very interesting concept. Would have been a really different movie, and frankly I think that would have been a huge blow to Michael Myers' career, because I mean it had been a few lean years since Austin Powers had been around when he picked the Shrek gig up.
Has obviously been major bank for him, so it's crazy. It's crazy to think about what might have been, and would Shrek even have been as much of a success with Farley? I assume it would have been, because that makes perfect sense, but there's no way of knowing.
Yeah, it does make you wonder for sure, for sure.
One last note on this episode is you did get to see Maggie already prove herself as the most clever Simpson without even having to say a word, where she's the one torturing everybody relentlessly at the end. But that's a common theme for the series. I did a paper on compare and contrast the Simpsons and Family Guy, and I had a huge part about Maggie versus Stewie in there. But it's just Maggie is the silent, most clever Simpson.
Interesting. That makes total sense to me. All right, so I think that's going to wrap it up for this week's episode of the Best Darn Diddly review show of The Simpsons. Before we get out of here, Richie, is there anything that you would like to plug this week?
I'm going to plug myself as always. You can follow me on Twitter. I'm at @thewiz_kid23. Big thank you again to my handy little guidebook here, The Simpsons, a complete guide to our favorite family. And no, none of this crap I've been talking about themes came from that book. I came up with that all on my own. It's original idea.
Awesome. Totally creatively yours. As usual, I am at Mr. Most Days Off on Twitter and pretty much everywhere else. Please come check me out there on YouTube, where you're going to find our movie review podcast that we do each and every Friday, as well as my thoughts on the WWE Cruiserweight Classic tournament, which has been going on. That comes out every Wednesday. Once again, I'd like to give a big shout out and thank you to Steve the Fan from thefanspodcast.com. Follow him on Twitter as well, at thefanspodcast. He's the one that was the brainchild behind this idea, gave the Wiz Kid and I here the opportunity to come on each and every week and talk about one of our favorite shows. Once again, we're going to be bringing you 2 episodes each and every week, just going through chronologically. Next week, we are going to be on to episode 5 and 6, which Richie was totally correct earlier. The next episode is, in fact, Bart the General, which I remember being one of my favorites from the early seasons, just because I think it is a very Bart-heavy episode, and I typically like that. Also, we are going to have Moaning Lisa, which I believe is going to introduce another character that we're both fond of. So, looking forward to that. We will see you next week for more of the Best Darn Diddly review show of The Simpsons.